Okay, hello everybody, and happy Friday, and welcome to the Tax Talk podcast put on by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, otherwise known as the CTF. My name is Paige MacPherson. I am the Alberta Director of the CTF, and joining me today are Todd MacKay. He's our Prairie Director at the Taxpayers Federation. Todd, do we have you now? Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can. We were having some technical difficulties, but that is good news. And also joining me is Colin Craig from the Manning Centre. He's the Director of Strategic Communications. Colin, how are you doing today?
Good. Yourself?
Doing well. Thank you very much. So just so everybody knows, my usual co-host, Jordan Bateman, is away on holiday today. He was hoping to win the Powerball, get an even better vacation, but unfortunately, I don't think he did. But he is somewhere on the West Coast there. So he's going to be joining us next week, but he's away for today. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that is absolutely paramount when it comes to transparency in Canada, especially when it comes to fiscal transparency. It's the First Nations Transparency Act, and it's been in the news lately, but it's not been for positive reasons. Essentially what's happened is that the federal Liberal government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has effectively removed the teeth from this act and made it more difficult to enforce. Some say it's rendering it, kind of useless. In principle, it's still there, but we're going to talk about exactly how the teeth have been removed and what the issues are there, because this is an issue that CTF has been on for quite some time, and it's an important one, when it comes to transparency in Canada, and also I would say equality of access to financial records for those Canadians, Native Canadians living on reserves, and then the rest of us who are not living on reserves. So I think there's an equality issue there too. So we're going to get into that issue. There are lots of ways that you can connect with us. If you've joined us here live, you can be sure to subscribe to our feed to keep track of all of our shows. You can comment on the sidebar. You can see some of our technical difficulty conversation there. It should be just to your right. And you can tweet at us as well. So normally you'd be able to tweet at my co-host Jordan at Jordan Bateman, but you can tweet at me at Paige MacP. You can tweet at Todd A. MacKay, and you can tweet at Colin at Colin Craig 1. Did I get that right, Colin?
That's right.
Okay, awesome. So you can also, if you'd like to ask us a question during this live podcast, you can type /Q into the sidebar here. I'll just do it as an example, and then you can write your question, and then we will see it come up on the side queue, and then we can answer it. So that's how you can sort of engage with us live. You can even click call in to ask us a question live on video. Just a little bit about the CTF. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy group. We are dedicated to three things: lower taxes, less waste, and government accountability. That's really what drives all the work we do, all of our communications, all of our research, and all of our advocacy work. So the First Nations Financial Transparency Act obviously ties into that pretty closely. So you can be sure to check out our website. It's www.taxpayer.com to see what Todd is up to see what I'm up to, Jordan, my co-host, and what the whole CTF team is working on. And actually, Colin used to be our Prairie Director. So I've got sort of the current Prairie Director with me and the former Prairie Director. So actually, if you go to our website, you can see a lot of Colin's former work as well. But of course, you can check him out now at the Manning Centre website. If you're listening to this later as a podcast or a recording, of course, we still want to hear from you. You can check out our website, as I mentioned, or you can email us. You can email me at abdirector@taxpayer.com, or you can engage with our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/taxpayer.com. So now we're going to get to what's new. Todd, what's new in your part of the woods, your neck of the woods over there?
Yeah, there's a few things that are going on. One of the major stories coming out of Manitoba specifically is the Manitoba Public Sector Union, MGEU, just stated that they've got a tentative agreement with the government, and the hallmark of the agreement is that they've got a no firing clause for 5 years. Manitoba Hydro just did it's just in the papers today, did a similar deal. You guys are both in Calgary. Can you imagine if folks there could get a no firing agreement for 5 years?
That'd be really good right now in particular.
Yeah, I mean, it's just not reality, right? With oil at below $30 a barrel. look, nobody wants to see anybody get fired. That's not what we're about. But the reality in Manitoba, particularly, is that the government can't afford the bureaucracy it's got. It's gotten way too big. It's bigger than virtually any other province on a per capita basis, and it's got to get smaller. If we make some of those decisions now, if we can move in that direction through things like early retirement and things like that, some small common sense decisions now, we can start to get this under control. If we punt on this for 5 years, don't make those adjustments, don't start getting government spending under control, don't get the size of government under control, we're going to be in a world of trouble 5 years down the road. I'm from Saskatchewan. I remember back in the day when Premier Romano, an NDP premier, closed 52 hospitals because the government budget got way too out of control. This isn't a partisan thing. This isn't an orange versus blue versus red versus any other color in a partisan situation. This is simply mathematical. If you spend too much money, eventually you've got to cut back. If you cut back slowly, it's manageable. If you wait, you have to cut back drastically. Let's not wait. So this MGEU deal is really it's a disservice, frankly, even to public service members and government employees, because it's a head in the sand kind of a deal. Changes have to be made, and by punting on this, we're really setting ourselves up for tougher changes down the road.
What about, quality of work? Obviously, we don't want to see anybody get fired, but if somebody, in any profession is not doing their job well or can't, perform the abilities or the responsibilities of that role, usually they would get fired or laid off. Is this something that, now we're not going to see, even if somebody, isn't able to perform their job duties?
Well, look, it's virtually impossible in many situations to get rid of a civil servant. Usually they just get shuffled around, and that's unfortunate. But even aside from lack of performance, I mean, you still can get rid of somebody if they're objectively terrible at their job, despite the fact it might be difficult. But there's also an issue of nimbleness, right? So the Manitoba Hydro deal is really a great example. This is an energy company, is ultimately what it is, no different than Suncor or Cenovus or anybody else. And they need to be able to adjust to changing market conditions. Can anybody really say that nothing's going to change in the energy industry in the next 3 years that might change how Manitoba Hydro needs to do its work? I mean, hopefully they come up with some innovations that make some of their work less labor intensive, and then some of those folks can be shifted to other areas. But by hamstringing themselves like this, it really takes away incentive and opportunity for innovation and ultimately service to Manitobans. So it's really unfortunate in that regard.
Yeah, there's so many issues with it. Colin, so you, as I mentioned, were in this gig for quite some time. Have you ever seen anything like this?
Yeah, the city of Winnipeg actually has a clause with CUPE, the largest union that it has an agreement with, and they have a similar clause that they call it a redeployment clause, to say that, look, you can't fire someone. If you're going to get rid of that particular position, you have to find them another position with the same pay and benefits. And obviously, it's a very rare clause, even in government, because it ties the hands of elected officials and decision makers from making efficient decisions. And so that's why we always opposed it when I was there, and I'm glad to see Todd still continuing to oppose it, because it's just not fair. I mean, like Todd said, no one wants to see the government go out and have to fire tons of people, but if they're not necessary, then you got to be looking at that, and there are ways to do it in a fair way. I know a couple of years ago, the government's own stats in Manitoba said that over the next 10 years, 40% of their workforce is going to be ready for retirement. So there's a huge opportunity to downsize in a way that a lot of those people that are working in those positions are treated fairly. So, right. And I also agree with Todd's comment about, look at what's happening here in Alberta. Well, what happens if the same starts to happen in Manitoba, if the economy starts to go south? It's not fair to the people in the private sector and businesses and other organizations that are paying taxes to support those government jobs. If they're getting laid off, then, there needs to be fairness in government too, right? Where those people have to feel the pinch too.
Well, you bring up a really good point, and I think it's about this disparity between the public and private sector. We know that, when it comes to pensions, perks, benefits, often wages, there is a disparity between the public and private sector in general, even when you adjust for qualifications. But I mean, Todd, is that an issue that's, being brought up there? I mean, this is something that would never, well, at least I have never heard of this happening in a company in the private sector where you absolutely can't get fired. There's no firing clause. It
doesn't happen in pro sports. I mean, you can score 50 goals in the NHL and still get cut the next year. I mean, that's the reality of life. And one of the things, and I know Colin wrote extensively about this in the past and in his book, but they fail to take into account many of these negotiations the taxpayer's ability to pay. And so one of the comments that we saw coming out of this deal with MGEU was, well, other public sector unions have gotten similar deals. Well, you don't go car shopping by walking around your neighborhood and seeing what your neighbors have and then going out and buying the same thing. Just because buddy next door can afford a brand new car doesn't mean you can afford it. Manitoba can't afford this. I mean, it's not that we don't want public sector folks to be adequately compensated, but at the end of the day, they're running a deficit of $500 million a year. Their debt is over $30 billion, and the interest payments, just the interest, so not paying down the debt, not getting ahead at all, but just the interest payments are $842 million a year. That's $650 per Manitoban. Look, I used to be in small business. We like to pay the folks that were working for us as much as we could. But at the end of the day, we had to, at times look at it and say, that's how much money we've got. We don't have more money. If you're going to be honest about Manitoba's financial situation, you've got to say, we don't have the money to pay more. In fact, we've got to shrink the size of the public service. This is a mathematical reality. It's not a partisan point of view. It's a mathematical reality. And the sooner we get back on track, the easier it's going to be. The longer we wait, the tougher it's going to be. So, let's get on her now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you remind me, yesterday I was talking about, there's some stuff going on here in Alberta, talking about public sector compensation. I'll get to that. But somebody said, when it comes to defined benefit pensions, when it comes to banked sick days, all these things that, you often do see in the government employee sector, but you don't see in the private sector. And somebody on Twitter said, oh, well, everybody should have it. I said, well, tell that to a small business owner. I mean, that's just not reality. So
everyone should have it.
Yeah.
Well, and that's it. And sometimes it's just not there. Like I said, with my small business, I like the guys who worked with us. If I could have paid them more, we would have. But if we would have paid them too much, we would have been out of business. And frankly, it's the same reality in government. It's just that the signals are somewhat distorted sometimes by partisanship. The reality is they're out of money. The sooner they recognize that reality, the better. And you got to be honest with the people you're working with too. Lying to them doesn't make it better.
Mm-hmm. I have to interrupt now because Jordan came in and gave a hearty hello from Great Wolf Lodge, south of Seattle, Washington. Had to jump in to congratulate Colin on the Vikings game last week. Go Packers.
That was a tough game because I like Seattle too. So at least one of the teams I like won. But I was cheering for the Vikings more.
Classic Jordan. All right, so Colin, you're obviously back in the winds that I am here in Calgary, but what's new with you? Anything caught your eye lately?
Well, the big thing that we're working on is the 2016 Manning Center Conference. That's a big conference we put on each year to bring together small C conservatives and classical liberals. So the people that have an ideology that supports a smaller role for government in our lives. So we put on this conference. Obviously, you're familiar with it. We have a lot of like-minded organizations. We get them in the same room, so to speak, and talk about issues. There's going to be some training workshops and that. So that's coming up. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about is sort of like an overall theme is what are the values that should shape contemporary small C conservatives in terms of what it is that we believe in, and then how do we apply those ideas to public policy areas. So I had a column recently in Sun newspapers where I took a crack at 5 values that I recommended to the movement. It's my own opinion. So I encourage things like letting the public decide more. So taking government from being all things to all people, which it's grown to become, and having it focus on those key government services, things like fixing roads, policing, and healthcare, those types of things. And then get rid of some of the activities and things that governments are spending money on. So these huge subsidies that we're seeing to companies like Bombardier, General Motors, and that. Stop doing that. Let the public decide. Leave the money in the public's pockets. And if they want to support those companies, then they can do so by buying one of their products or maybe investing in the company, that type of thing. So that was one of the values. I won't go through them all, but if people want to go to any of the major Sun newspapers, they can find the column. It's called 5 Values for Conservatives to Embrace. So a couple of the other ones, look at social assistance programs that shift them from being a handout to a hand up, where you require people to actually, give back to their community in some fashion. Things like government transparency, being more open and accountable, looking at things like recall legislation to give taxpayers another tool to hold their elected officials accountable.
Yes,
and then also, what's that?
We like that.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the other ones I'll highlight is fiscal responsibility, making sure that governments balance their budgets, saying goodbye to things like stimulus spending because it doesn't work. So those types of things. And like I said, there's a whole bunch of other examples in the column. And if people want to read it, they can. If they're interested in coming to the conference, that would be great. They can find out more about that at manningscenter.ca.
Yeah, that's great. It is a great column. I've read it. Now, we always do send a few people to the Manning conference. A few of us, CTFers do like to go because it is a meeting of the minds when it comes to fiscal responsibility. I mean, that always is a big issue at the conference. It's going to be an interesting one this year because, the other people who attend the conference are the people on the more partisan side, right? People who are more involved with the Conservative Party or other conservative parties in the different provinces. And it's an interesting time for those folks right now. I don't have much insight into that, but I know that they must be in some kind of a rebuild of some kind. So I mean, the conference should probably be interesting for that reason too, Colin, to see, we always like any political party putting fiscal responsibility on the agenda. So I'm hoping that those people who are there to talk about that care about low taxes and government accountability as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you're right. I mean, if you look at the political map, in Canada, we've got non-conservative parties running 8 of 10 provinces. Obviously, the federal government is now run by the Liberal government, and it's not clear exactly what direction Justin Trudeau is going to take as a government, but certainly his early indications is that he's not going to be of the fiscal responsible persuasion, given that he openly campaigned on racking up another $30 billion in debt. So that's not a good thing. I think that our side of the spectrum needs to have a rethink about how we address some of these issues, because we don't have as many like-minded or sympathetic elected officials in office. So that plays into the theme of the conference, which is recharging the right. How do we get these organizations that are not just organizations, but political parties too, that are trying to put forward these small c conservative ideas? What is it that we need to do differently so that we can see some of those policies being, some of the policies that we want being enacted more often?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it is. I mean, I have to think that the election, based on my own analysis, was a lot about personality. I think that, after almost a decade, people were tired of Harper, and that's what I rack it up to a lot. I think it was a referendum more on personality than it was on policies, but it's depressing that, deficits were a part of the platform that got elected. And this is after, I do think balanced budgets are something that governments of all stripes tend to prioritize now in Canada, which is such a positive thing. I mean, we didn't see that even, a few decades ago. So it is a really positive step forward. And obviously, Paul Martin as finance minister, Jean Chrétien as prime minister, the Liberal Party itself has a good history of balancing budgets and making those tough decisions to ensure future prosperity by, ensuring fiscal responsibility. But it does seem like a bit of an uphill battle, right? For anybody who cares about fiscal responsibility right now. Here in Alberta, you've got a government that did run on deficits. We're seeing deficits are even larger, probably going to see the same thing at the federal level. So, it's a little bit of an uphill climb.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that, certainly Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien, they did a good job at getting the deficit under control. And there were a lot of other governments at the time that were doing similar things. Gary Filmon's Progressive Conservative Party of Manitoba, Mike Harris in Ontario with the Conservatives there. There was a movement towards balanced budgets and that. I think we've lost a lot of that momentum over the last 5-7 years now, because so many governments have been running deficits well beyond the economic slowdown period. I mean, that was 5 years or so ago. and yet we're still seeing governments across the country in a sea of red ink. Not all of them. There's some good stories out there, but more often than not, I don't think we're winning on that issue. So we've got to rethink how we address that issue. And that's going to be one of the things we're going to talk about at the conference.
Cool. Well, it's going to be interesting. I'm going to be there, so I'm looking forward to it. I will tell you what's new here in Alberta. So Colin's obviously already aware, but this week the government announced a wage freeze. But don't get too excited, and it sounds really good right off the bat. So they announced a wage freeze only for non-unionized government employees. So most of those people who aren't in the union are managers, people with high salaries, a bit of an easy target, but also, you know, a good place to look for savings. So it's good that we're seeing this 2-year wage freeze put in place. What's unfortunate is that you've only got it for non-unionized employees, which is a really small percentage of all government sector employees in the province. It's actually only 3.5% of all of the workers in the province. So it affects about 7,000 people. And in total in Alberta's government employee sector, and by that I mean, you know, the total public sector, you've got 200,445. So it's affecting 7,000 of those people, and it's just a wage freeze. And unfortunately, I mean, it's kind of more of a symbolic gesture than it is a meaningful spending cut. They're saying that they're going to cut $28.5 million a year. It's good that they're looking in this direction. I mean, we definitely think it's a step in the right direction, and it's positive for that reason. And any reducing spending is good, but frankly, they've got an $8.9 billion deficit when they account for infrastructure spending. So they're looking at a really, really, really whopping deficit. They're shoveling a lot of debt onto the backs of future generations. So a $28.5 million spending reduction from a wage freeze is not really that ambitious. ETF have called for something a little better. We call for a 10% reduction in compensation for all government employees across the board, everybody in the public sector. That would save taxpayers, as an example, $2.5 billion every year. That's making meaningful steps towards reducing the deficit and reducing that debt load eventually, right? So that's what we've called for. It does, when you, I think, put it in perspective, you know, in comparison, make the government's move seem pretty small. The savings are only representative of about 0.1% of what taxpayers are going to spend on total government employee compensation for this year. That's all that they're talking about. So obviously 10% is a lot more than that. And the other thing that I'll mention, and this might be interesting to you as well, Todd, is that Alberta's government employees are paid on average about, well, the number is $7,526 more than the national average, according to Statistics Canada. So when you compare Alberta's, you know, government employees to people in the private sector, on average, they make more, even adjusting for qualifications. And when you compare them to other people in the public sector across Canada, they're making more as well. I mean, we've been on a spending train for quite some time here. So it's nice to see the government taking this step in the right direction. But like I said, it's a little more show than it is substance. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, one of the good things that this can do is create a little bit of moral authority when they're at the negotiating table with public sector union negotiators going further, saying, hey, look, on this side of the table, we're not getting raises. I'm sorry, we can't offer them on your side as well. So that's the way they could use this tool. You know, honestly, I was listening to the coverage. I was up on the west side of Saskatchewan, so I was listening to the coverage coming out of Calgary, and I was disappointed to hear the finance minister's comments on some of that. He said, well, you know, this will probably be a factor in public sector negotiations. A factor? This is going to be something we're going to think about? Like, he needs to be saying, look, guys, we've got big trouble here. If we deal with it quickly and effectively, maybe we can head some of this off. But a factor? This isn't something to think about. This isn't something to discuss over the water cooler. This isn't something we should get on top of next year. This isn't a New Year's resolution to eat better. This is an existential issue that needs to be dealt with right quickly, and for the sake of public sector unions as well as, and more importantly, for taxpayers in Alberta. The other thing is, too, and I think you're rightly pointing on this a little bit, too, you know, in the rest of the country, you know, Alberta is often demonized as being, you know, too quick to cut and so on. Really, that's a myth. Spending in Alberta on a per capita basis has been higher than a lot of other provinces for a long time. Public sector employees have been paid more in Alberta for a long time. And that was under a conservative government. And I think that kind of goes back to what Colin was talking about earlier and what they're trying to do at the Manning Centre, and especially with the Manning Conference. Just because you say you're conservative doesn't mean that that's a point of view that you're actually espousing and putting into practice. And I think we've got to, on our side, get back to that a little bit and put some of those things into practice. And, that's something the CTF can do in terms of holding people's feet to the fire on all sides of the political spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Because CTF stands for lower taxes, but also less waste, right? So Alberta has been, comparatively good on the tax side, but not great on the waste side at all. You're absolutely right. In the budget, not the NDP's October budget, but the PC's former government spring budget, they actually acknowledged that per capita spending on programs in Alberta was about $1,500 higher than the national average. So each person in Alberta, we're spending about $1,500 more than the rest of the country is. That's some pretty high spending. So you're absolutely right. It's something that we have to get under control. What were your thoughts when you saw this, Colin?
Well, I mean, it's not surprising. I lived under the NDP for a long time in Manitoba. They're in bed with the unions. It's just a part of the NDP's DNA. Like, they actually set aside delegate positions at their conventions for public sector union bosses and that. So to hear that, they don't want to do anything to curtail the salaries of union members, it's not surprising. But I think it even goes beyond just NDP parties when they're in offices. There is a reluctance overall by elected officials to address public sector compensation costs. And no one has a problem giving a government employee a good competitive pay package that's in line with someone in the private sector who's doing similar work. The problem is that doesn't happen. Government salaries are increasing faster and their benefits are increasing faster than everyone else. And that's just simply not fair to taxpayers. So you look at Alberta, I think average weekly earnings over the past year have dropped by about 3% or something like that. But we don't see that in government. And we probably won't see that in government. We see instead the government saying, well, we'll give you a wage freeze. So everyone outside government is getting a cut and government employees get a freeze. So, things like that, they're just not fair. And that's the funny thing about these public sector unions. I always hear them talk about fairness until it comes to, fairness for the taxpayer, making sure that if the taxpayer is feeling the pinch, that, public sector unions feel the pinch too. So it's pretty ridiculous, but it's something that we need, I think, politicians across the spectrum to address more in this country, is to have the courage to actually stand up for taxpayers and start renegotiating some of these contracts.
Yeah, I agree. Well, fingers crossed. I'm a little more optimistic than you, or hopeful maybe that this is setting that benchmark, that they're going to go to the public sector union negotiation table. There are contracts that are going to be up this year for renegotiation, next year as well. Hopefully they're doing this to set a precedent. But a lot of people are saying what you are, Colin, don't hold your breath, but let's hope and keep pushing in that direction. Okay, let's get to the real topic that we really want to talk about here, which is, of course, the First Nations Transparency Act. So Todd, as I mentioned, our Prairie director at the CTF, he's been doing some great work on this topic. And of course, Colin, as I mentioned, former Prairie director of the CTF, also has done some really, really great work on this topic. So recently, kind of delivering a blow to both transparency in Canada and like I said, equality of access for both Native and non-Native persons, the federal Liberal government removed the teeth from the First Nations Financial Transparency Act. So I'll just give some context. Federal Liberal Indigenous and Northern Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett recently reinstated funding that had been withheld from band councils that did not comply with the act. She also suspended court actions against them. So what that really means is that Aboriginal Canadians have been stripped of the security of knowing that they can see what their band councils and chiefs are up to when it comes to their finances. So what I'm wondering from you guys is, what does this mean for Native Canadians, Aboriginal Canadians on reserves, and what does this mean for taxpayers wanting to know how these billions of dollars in federal program spending are being spent? So let's talk about it. Let's start from the beginning, though. Todd, do you want to tell us a little bit of, tell us a little bit of the history of how this act came about and how we got to where we are now?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll just give the broad strokes of what the legislation was, and actually I'll kick it to Colin to talk about the history because he was the one actually living it. But the legislation is actually very, very simple. First of all, it requires band leadership, so chief and council, to publish their salaries. Yeah, like this is what every leader in the world. I mean, you fire up the Google machine and you want to know what the head of state in South Africa makes, you've got it in 0.5 seconds. So pretty hard to imagine why that can't happen at Onion Lake First Nation. So secondly, it requires them to publish their expenses. Again, if you want your expenses paid by your boss, you show your boss a receipt. That's how it should work on First Nations as well. So it's just a simple a thing there. And then thirdly, to provide basic financial documents for band-owned, for the band generally, including band-owned businesses. Now, again, this is standard procedure. You look at Saskatchewan Transportation Company, the Crown Bus Company in Saskatchewan, that loses about $1 million a month. That's bad, but they're open about it. You can read their annual report. You can find out how much their employees are paid. It's openness because they're open to shareholders, ultimately citizens are shareholders. Now, most First Nations have complied with this legislation. More than 93% have complied. That's hundreds of them coast to coast have complied. There's been a few holdouts. Primarily led by Onion Lake First Nation and Chief Wallace Fox out there, who simply don't want to open their books to First Nations people on reserve, their own people. They won't tell them how much they're getting paid. So that's the problem. That's what the legislation was, and it gave the government the power to withhold non-essential funding. And we're talking about non-essential, so we're not talking about schools or healthcare. Nobody's failing to get an education because of funds that were withheld. We're not even talking about like kids hockey or something like that. Like the non-essential funding we're talking about is like administration funding. So pension payments, stuff that would be easy to catch up on as soon as these bands come into compliance. So they withheld some of that funding, and secondly started taking court action to get an injunction to have a judge say, hey, yeah, tell your folks what you're spending the money on, which it's weird that you have to go to the courts to do that, but okay. So Minister Bennett, on the Friday before Christmas, and I'm going to digress just a little bit. If you're talking to spin doctors and stuff like that, if they've got bad news they want to get out, they want to get it out on a Friday afternoon when reporters don't care anymore and nobody's reading the newspaper.
Before Christmas, too.
And the Friday before Christmas, that's the day you dump the worst possible news, because nobody cares the Friday before Christmas. So the Friday before Christmas, Minister Bennett put out a statement saying that the government cares a lot about accountability and transparency, but they're not going to hold First Nations accountable. There's a weird paradox in 200 words or so. And so that's what she did. Obviously, the government is not proud of this. They're not proud to hide information from First Nations people. But that's something they're doing to try to get the support of certain chiefs. But you know what? This is an interesting story from the start, so maybe I'll kick it to Colin to tell us how we got on this train.
Sure, yeah. I think what's important for everyone to remember is that this wasn't something that the CTF dreamed up out of the blue one day. It came after a lot of grassroots Aboriginal people coming to us for years saying that they couldn't get this basic information, such as how much their chief and council were getting paid. And I would talk to grassroots band members that would say, yeah, I just got the band's financial statements and the chief gave me the stack, but he pulled out the pages with his salary and how much his colleagues on council are making. And so they weren't getting the full story. And like Todd said, I mean, this is something that's been a standard for off-reserve governments for years. I mean, it's been decades now that people could find out how much their provincial premier makes, how much their city councillor makes, how much the prime minister makes, all those types of things. So, it really wasn't anything too intrusive. It was just basic accountability in terms of expenses. Todd mentions they have to disclose their expenses. It's not even the finite details that they have to disclose. It's the total. What are your total expenses? Oh, $50,000. We still don't even know. How did they expense $50,000 of expenses? So it really wasn't that intrusive. Like I say, it's a basic accountability thing. And it came because we had heard from so many grassroots people that they wanted this information. They wanted to know how much their chiefs and councillors were making. So it wasn't some complex matter that required, 3 years of, discussions and consultations or anything like that. It just made sense. It made sense to us because we were also hearing from taxpayers. They're getting fed up when they would hear that there'd be a leaked story about a chief or a councillor making tons of money, because of course most bands receive a lot of their funding from taxpayers. And when people pay taxes and those dollars are going to go to a reserve, you expect it to help the grassroots, help them with, you know, education and skills training, whatever it is, healthcare, to make sure that they can have better outcomes. But when that doesn't happen and the money's getting hoovered up by the chiefs and councillors at the top, and that, you know, that obviously frustrates a lot of taxpayers, often who are also Aboriginal people that live off reserve, and they don't want their money that goes back to the reserve being wasted. So the tipping point on this file came in 2009. I received a brown envelope from a lady on the Peguis Reserve, and she shared the band's finances in terms of how much the chief and council were making. The salaries were off the charts. They were all basically making more than Stephen Harper, the prime minister at the time. So they had this tiny little reserve of, you know, a few thousand people. And the chief council there were making more than the prime minister, who of course was serving around, you know, 33, 35 million people at the time. So it was obscene. And when we decided to release it to the media, we didn't just release it and, you know, create the usual firestorm that comes when these stories come about. We decided to call for change. And so what I had proposed internally was, I said, well, let's also call for change when we release it, and we'll ask the government to start posting the salaries of all these chiefs and councillors for every reserve across the country. Just put it on the federal government's website, because the feds were getting these same reports. So all it would require would be for someone to either take the digital copy and post it to a web page, or else, you know, stand by the photocopy machine and scan these documents and then post them. So it wasn't really a huge paperwork burden. It would have been pretty easy to do. And that's when we started the call. And from there, things kind of snowballed, because the story from Peguis attracted national media attention. And that led to more people from other reserves across the country sending us their band's information. Somehow they would sneak it out. They would know someone who worked in the band office who would, you know, stand by the photocopier one night late at night and photocopy the details and sneak it out and then get it out to us, and we would, you know, send it to everyone, kind of thing. So that's how things happen. Of course, we led a strong push to get the act in place, and that the government responded with the legislation. And now, of course, we are where we are.
So I'll pose this question. I'll ask both of you. Maybe Todd, you can answer first. You know, are there any examples that stand out to you of irresponsible use of funds by any specific band councils? I mean, that would sort of make this, okay, here's an example of why this kind of thing matters.
Yeah, so I would mention a few things when you start looking through the hundreds of pages of documents that come out. First of all, one of the great things about accountability, once you put the light on things, you see both the good and the bad. So I want to mention a guy named Chief Porter from Bonaparte First Nation. He got interviewed, and he was in the media because he wasn't taking any pay at all. And people asked him why. He's like, well, I got a good job. This doesn't take that much of my time. I don't need the money. And so that's somebody standing up for their community and just pitching in. So that's great. And Chief Porter needs to get credit for that. There's a lot of First Nations leaders that are doing a good job and being very accountable. But of course, on the other side, we saw Chief Giesbrecht in Coquitlam, who took almost $1 million from a band of 85 people. Like, I don't understand how that can happen, and certainly how you could possibly justify hiding that. I mean, that's just an astronomical amount of money. But then there's the little things too, and it's always interesting in these kind of situations, the little things that jump out at you. And when I was going through some of this information this summer, there's a band called MacKay in northern Saskatchewan, around the Meadow Lake area. And one of their band counselors had a cell phone allowance of $6,000 a year. Like, I don't even know how you do that. Like, if you walk up to your cell phone kiosk in the mall and say, hey, can you give me the most expensive deal you've got? I don't think you can get to $6,000. I don't know how to do it. And that goes to Colin's point that it tallies up the totals on a lot of these expenses. It doesn't say where the money's going. For example, if Duffy had been working there, I don't think we would have ever heard about the problems that he had. But it was $6,000. And that actually, it took me a few days to kind of tweak with it. But and I don't want to draw too close a line in terms of cause of effect. But MacKay was in the news somewhat earlier because they'd had a fire where two kids died. And it was in part because they hadn't paid their firefighters bill of about $3,800. it's just hard for me to understand that kind of stuff where you can have hundreds of thousands of dollars getting blown out the door with very little accountability, and then something as simple as paying local firefighters doesn't happen, and then you get yourself into a dangerous situation. And again, I don't want to say that one thing led directly to another, but at the same time, look, we stand up for taxpayers. We do want to know where the taxpayers' dollars are going here. But frankly, to me, much more importantly is making sure people on reserve know where this money is going and make sure it's going where it needs to go. That's actually the highest priority here. And when you see $6,000 cell phone bills in places where there's a lot of poverty, that's just it's just wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I think actually Todd raises a good point, and I think there is a connection between these types of examples where you see money being wasted on salaries or travel expenses or something ridiculous, and then you see the social effect. Mm-hmm. And I also like what Todd said about a lot of good chiefs and councillors out there, and I think this legislation helps them because once you know how much everyone's making, you can tell who the ones are that are abusing the system versus those who are working hard. They're not taking a lot. There's a great example from Standing Buffalo First Nation, which is, I think it's about half an hour to an hour northeast of Regina, that touches on those 2 points, a good politician and also the cause and effect. There's a lady there named Stella Isnana, and she got elected to the band council. And shortly after getting elected, they started to give her money for different things. And she was saying, well, what's this for? What's that for? And, she started to speak out. She said, well, we don't deserve all this pay. Like, why are you giving me all this money? Like, we need deserve a reasonable level of compensation and stop there. Like, stop giving us all this extra money. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of abuse that was happening. And she actually blew the whistle and said, this isn't right. She went public. But at the same time, one of the things that was either her or someone else from the community had mentioned to me when I talked to them was that the community had a youth suicide problem. So you had kids who were obviously, committing suicide, very tragic situation. And some people, there was a substance abuse problem as well. So there were a lot of these social issues that, should have been addressed. And some people went to the band to say, can we get a few extra bucks to, for a program to deal with these, to bring in a counselor, whatever it was. And they were told no. And at the same time, you had the chief who was making, I think it was more than Stephen Harper at the time, another ridiculous example of compensation gone wild. And if, again, if you had brought those compensation levels down to more reasonable levels, then there would be money to address the youth suicide problem. There'd be more money to address substance abuse issues, to get kids into good education programs, to, pay the fire bill, whatever it is, right? So that's a big part of this whole discussion is accountability. Where's money going? Because so often we hear about these problems on different reserves, and then everyone says, well, Ottawa needs to cut a bigger check to, buy more fire trucks or something like that. And it's important to ask, well, wait a second, where's the money going right now? And if it's being used efficiently, then maybe, we can have a discussion about, buying more fire trucks. And if you've got a case for the elected officials are raking in tons of money, then obviously that discussion about sending a bigger check shouldn't be happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really puts things in perspective. For me, the biggest issue for me, I agree with you, Todd. It's about the people who are living on reserves, and it's an equality issue. Why should every other Canadian have access to this kind of financial information for our politicians, and then Canadians living on reserves don't have access? That to me is just, it's appalling. But I'll ask you both, we're running out of time, but just last question quickly, what are the next steps? How likely is it that we're going to see positive progress from the federal Liberal government on this issue?
Well, that's it's hard to say for sure. I think Minister Bennett's really painted herself into a very, very difficult corner. On one hand, she's got to appease a few chiefs, like Chief Wallace Fox, who led the court case against the government for Onion Lake First Nation. He thinks that this legislation is racist. He calls it racist. I don't think. For her to appease Chief Fox, all she can do is capitulate. That's really the only option. He's not going to endorse any kind of accountability. I was just in Onion Lake 2 days ago. I saw the so-called accountability documents that they provide to their own people. It's a joke. You'd get more accountability from your local curling club. Like it's ridiculous. you're not going to get Chief Fox to agree with any kind of accountability. So on one side, she's put herself in a position where she's got to make somebody like Chief Fox happy. On the other side, she's to go out, and if she does make Chief Fox happy, she's going to look stupid to everybody else. She's going to have to go out and say a guy like Chief Fox, who's right now facing domestic assault charges, shouldn't have to be accountable to the folks on his reserve, that he shouldn't have to say how much he's getting paid, he shouldn't have to say how he's spending thousands of dollars on travel expenses, shouldn't have to say what's going on with millions of dollars worth of investments, because Onion Lake is in oil country. She's going to have to go out and say she's hiding that stuff. I mean, that stuff, I don't know how she's going to reconcile that. I think she's in big trouble. And really, for her, the clock is ticking. Right now, this isn't hitting the fan. It's all kind of theoretical at this point. But the next filing deadline comes this summer at the end of July. If there's no enforcement in place prior to that filing deadline in July, I think it's reasonable to expect the compliance rates are going to go down. And then suddenly she's not being, the government's not delivering accountability to First Nations folks that everybody else is used to getting. And now First Nations folks are used to getting it. They've gotten it 2 years in a row, and she's going to be the one taking it away. I'm tempted to feel sorry for Minister Bennett. In a way, she's got herself in an almost impossible situation. But because she put herself in that situation, I'm resisting that temptation to feel sorry for her. Ultimately, I think realistically, the only alternative that she can get to is enforcing the current legislation. I honestly don't see what else she can do, but whether she reaches that conclusion or not is still an open question.
All right. Well, Colin, do you have any final thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, I would just say that we need to think about where this legislation came from, how it came about. And it came about because at the time of the CTF, we made the issue so big that the government couldn't ignore it. And we did that by constantly just, pushing and pushing and pushing on the issue and constantly urging everyday Canadians to speak out. And that's what needs to happen now to keep it. Because as Todd points out, she tried to bring in this announcement right around Christmas time when no one's paying attention because she knows it's not popular. And I think everyday Canadians need to keep contacting their new Liberal members of Parliament and say to them, no, don't get rid of that legislation. Give your head a shake. The grassroots people in this country living on reserves, I'm sure the vast majority of them want that bill because they want to know what's going on with public funds. And then obviously taxpayers want it too. So this issue cuts across party lines. Public opinion research shows that overwhelmingly Canadians want more accountability for funds that are transferred to Aboriginal reserves. And the public's on our side. It's a matter of mobilizing them and convincing the Liberal government to back down on this.
All right. Yes, couldn't agree more. So let's move on now to our Waste of the Week story. We're running out of time, Todd, so I'll get you to maybe just spitfire around Waste of the Week. What do you have going on there in the prairies?
So the Blue Bombers got a new stadium. They just finished it. They just got into it. The original bill was supposed to be just over $100 million. The actual bill came in at $235 million. So the price over doubled. They're over $100 million over budget. The Bombers and a few others started making payments on it, but it's kind of ridiculous. It's kind of like making the minimum payment on your big credit card bill because it's not even paying down the principal. The interest is going up more than they're paying it down. We've got to stop paying for these luxurious mega projects and keep taxpayers' money for things that we can actually afford, because both the city of Winnipeg and the government of Manitoba are out of money.
Well, that does ring true here in Calgary, where, they're talking about taxpayers funding a glitzy new NHL arena downtown. So, yeah, I mean, Colin, did you have any history with this stadium when you were out there?
Yeah, of course. And we had proposed actually one option for renovating the existing stadium that could have got another 10, 20 years out of the place. I mean, it wasn't a great glitzy stadium, but it was good enough to go and sit for 3 hours and watch a football game. And I used to do it many times myself. And we actually suggested a plan where they could renovate the thing, and it wouldn't even cost taxpayers money. And that would be by developing land a bit more that the Bombers owned around the existing stadium at the time. And also charging fans a ticket tax to pay for renovating stadium. So it would be those that use the stadium would be the ones that would pay for it. So we proposed that, and no one liked that because they fell in love with these glitzy drawings that the government came out. When I say no one, I'm talking about the elite in Winnipeg, the political class and some of the other chattering class that just simply wanted a new stadium, and it was an emotional thing for them. They referred to people like myself and others as naysayers. Now, of course, we can laugh because we warned about the problems with the project. We also pushed for a referendum. That never happened. And we raised concerns about the fact that they started building this thing without knowing what the final design would be. They didn't know what the cost would be, and they didn't know who was going to pay for it. So it was just an absolute gong show from the beginning. And now our side can kind of laugh a little bit, but not too hard, because, of course, we're talking about hardworking Manitobans' tax dollars that have been obviously wasted in this project due to mismanagement by Sellinger and crew that were trying to ram this project through. So yeah, it's frustrating, but in a way, we've been proven to be right. So
naysayer, I got called a hater here when it comes to the Calgary Arena project. There's always fun names. All right, well, that is it. We've run out of time for this episode of Tax Talk from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Like I said, you can be sure to follow us all on Twitter. I'm at Paige MacP. Todd is at Todd A. MacKay, M-A-C, for both of our names. And Colin is at Colin Craig 1. And of course, you can always catch my pal Jordan, our pal Jordan, in BC at Jordan Bateman on Twitter. And he's going to be back next week. So if you're watching this on Blab, again, be sure to subscribe to our feed. Give us some props. And if you're listening to this on iTunes, please subscribe. And hey, give us a good rating if you're feeling generous. Again, you can check out our website at taxpayer.com. Tax Talk's going to return next week, Friday, January 22nd at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. That's 10 a.m. Mountain. And we're going to have more great tax talk then, more interesting guests for you. So you can visit us all taxpayer.com/tax talk. Again, happy Friday, everybody, and have a great weekend. Thank you, Todd and Colin, so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot.